The courtroom was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Emma Martinez sat rigidly in the wooden chair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Every muscle in her body was tense, every nerve ending screaming with anxiety. She could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing down on her shoulders, though most people were absorbed in their own concerns, their own cases, their own desperate circumstances. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she first met Daniel Chen at a coffee shop near the university where she worked as an administrative assistant. He'd been charming, ambitious, successful, everything she thought she wanted. He worked in finance, made good money, and spoke about their future with such confidence that Emma had believed in it completely. Within 2 years, they were living together. Within 3 years, Lily was born. But somewhere between Lily's birth and her 3rd birthday, Daniel had transformed from the man Emma knew into someone she barely recognized. The ambition that had seemed attractive became obsession. The long work hours became resentment that he was missing important moments with his daughter. The confidence became controlling behavior. He criticized how Emma parented, how she managed the household, how she split her time between work and motherhood. Nothing was ever good enough. When Emma had finally worked up the courage to end the relationship 2 years ago, she thought it would bring relief. Instead, it had brought chaos. Daniel's expensive law firm, the one he worked for as a senior analyst, had connected him with an equally expensive divorce attorney. The legal fees must have been astronomical, but Daniel seemed willing to pay whatever it took. Emma had hired the best lawyer she could afford on her modest salary, Marcus Webb, a kind-hearted but visibly overworked attorney who handled multiple cases in his small practice. The disparity in resources felt like a physical disadvantage. For 18 months, the custody battle had raged. Daniel had painted a narrative in which Emma was a neglectful, emotionally cold mother who prioritized work over her daughter's well-being. He had witnesses, some legitimate, some questionable, who testified that Emma left Lily with babysitters too often, that Lily seemed withdrawn and anxious, that Emma was unable to provide the stable, nurturing environment a child needed. None of it was true, but the narrative was compelling because Daniel told it with such conviction, and his lawyers knew exactly how to weaponize it. Emma had fought back with everything she had. She'd reduced her work hours, taking a significant pay cut that made her financial situation precarious. She'd enrolled Lily in therapy to address the anxiety that had developed as a result of the custody battle itself, a cruel irony that her daughter's emotional struggles were being used as evidence against her. She documented every moment of care, every school pickup, every bedtime story, every scraped knee she'd bandaged. But documentation couldn't compete with narrative, and narrative was Daniel's greatest weapon. The worst part was how the battle had affected Lily. The vibrant, talkative toddler Emma had given birth to had become quieter, more withdrawn. Lily would sometimes have panic attacks when Emma dropped her off at Daniel's house for scheduled visitations. She developed selective mutism in certain situations, speaking freely at home and with her grandmother but becoming silent and anxious in unfamiliar environments or during stressful interactions. Emma blamed herself for putting her daughter through this trauma, even though she knew, intellectually, that she was fighting for their right to stay together. Emma's mother, Gloria, had been her greatest source of support. Gloria had moved in with them 8 months ago, helping with childcare, paying for part of the legal fees, and providing the emotional anchor that kept Emma from completely drowning. Without her mother, Emma wasn't sure she would have survived this period. There were nights when she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering if she'd done the right thing leaving Daniel, if she'd destroyed her daughter's life by refusing to tolerate his controlling behavior. And now here they were. Today's hearing was supposed to be the final determination. The judge would decide custody arrangements that would affect the rest of Lily's childhood. Emma had rehearsed scenarios in her mind 1,000 times. Best case, Emma would get primary custody, with Daniel having supervised visitation. Realistic case, joint custody with some arrangement about school and living situations. Worst case, Daniel's wealth and legal resources would win out, and she'd lose significant time with her daughter. She dressed carefully that morning. A conservative navy blazer, modest jewelry, her hair pulled back professionally. She'd wanted to look like a responsible parent, like someone the judge should trust. Gloria had helped her pick out her outfit, and they'd gone through her testimony together, practicing answers to questions that Marcus had warned her about. But preparation only went so far. Emma's anxiety was a living thing in her chest, pressing against her ribs, making it difficult to breathe. Lily sat beside her, small and perfect in a little white dress that Gloria had helped her choose. Emma had debated whether bringing Lily into the courtroom was the right decision. Her lawyer had said it might help. Let the judge see them together, see the bond between mother and daughter. But it also meant exposing her child to the ugliness of the legal process, to the tension and formality and judgment that saturated the air. Lily had been quiet all morning. Not the normal quiet of a 3-year-old focused on something, but the anxious quiet of a child sensing that something important was happening. She kept asking when they could go home. Emma kept reassuring her with words she didn't entirely believe. Daniel sat across the courtroom with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Patricia Thornton, who'd been systematically dismantling Emma's case for the past year and a half. Daniel looked calm, confident, almost bored. He wore an expensive suit and checked his watch occasionally, as if the entire legal proceeding was merely an inconvenience interrupting his important day. That casual indifference infuriated Emma more than anything else could have. This was their daughter's future. How could he treat it with such dismissal? The judge had not yet entered. They were waiting, all of them suspended in a state of anticipatory dread. Emma's lawyer sat beside her, organizing documents, looking tired in the way that overworked public defenders always looked. He'd been kind to her, had fought hard despite his obvious resource constraints, but Emma wondered if kindness would be enough against Patricia Thornton's aggressive strategy. And then the judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Harold Whitmore was known in the legal community as fair but firm, progressive in some ways but traditional in others. He believed in parental involvement, in shared custody when possible, in the importance of maternal bonds, but also in the modern family structure. Emma didn't know which way he'd lean. As everyone settled back into their seats as the proceedings were about to officially begin, Emma reached over and squeezed Lily's small hand. Her daughter looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes, and Emma saw fear there. Fear and trust. Lily believed that her mother would fix this, would make everything okay. And Emma had absolutely no idea if that was true. The judge called the hearing to order. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. The judge's gavel hadn't even fully descended before Emma heard the noise. It started as a low sound from somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, the deliberate, measured footsteps of someone walking with purpose. Multiple sets of footsteps, actually. Emma's stomach clenched. Something was about to happen, something that wasn't on the schedule Marcus had reviewed with her a dozen times. Patricia Thornton leaned back in her chair with a knowing smile, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. That smile alone was enough to make Emma's anxiety spike to dangerous levels. She gripped the edge of the table, her fingernails digging into the wood. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. Daniel's attorney wouldn't be smiling like that if it was anything that could possibly help Emma's case. The courtroom doors swung open with the kind of authority that made everyone's attention snap toward them simultaneously. A uniformed police officer walked through first, a tall, stern-looking man with a rigid posture and an expression that suggested he took his work with profound seriousness. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible at first, came an absolutely massive German shepherd. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave. One woman in the gallery actually clutched her chest. A man in the back row muttered something under his breath. Even the court clerk seemed startled, looking toward the judge for clarification. Emma felt the world tilt slightly beneath her. What on earth was a police dog doing in a custody hearing? Lily's entire body went rigid beside her. Emma felt her daughter's small hand grip hers with surprising strength. The 3-year-old's eyes had grown enormous, fixed on the dog with a mixture of fear and fascination. Emma instinctively moved to comfort her child, but she was frozen, paralyzed by confusion and dread. The judge didn't seem surprised. He nodded slowly at the police officer, as if confirming something they'd previously discussed. That's when Emma's heart truly began to race. The judge knew about this. This was planned, which meant Patricia Thornton had engineered this somehow, had convinced the judge that this bizarre evaluation was necessary. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Whitmore said formally, "thank you for accommodating this court's request. You may proceed with the assessment." Marcus leaned over to Emma, whispering urgently, "I don't know what this is. I swear I don't know what this is. Did Daniel's team mention anything about this?" Emma shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat had tightened, making it nearly impossible to swallow. Patricia Thornton stood up, addressing the judge with confidence. "Your Honor, we've arranged for a specialized behavioral assessment that uses trained police animals to evaluate how children respond to pressure, fear, and stressful stimuli. This evaluation has become increasingly popular in custody cases because it provides objective data about a child's emotional stability, resilience, and psychological well-being. A child who can remain calm and rational under stress demonstrates emotional maturity and security. A child who becomes hysterical or uncontrollable demonstrates emotional fragility or inadequate emotional parenting." Emma felt her face flush. This was it. This was the trap. They'd known about Lily's selective mutism, her anxiety issues, the panic attacks she sometimes had. And they'd engineered this scenario specifically to demonstrate that Lily was emotionally unstable, that she was poorly adjusted, that Emma hadn't given her the emotional tools she needed to handle stress. The judge explained to Emma and Marcus, almost apologetically, that this evaluation had been approved in the preliminary hearing documents they'd both signed months ago. Emma's mind raced backward through the countless pages of legal documents she'd reviewed with Marcus, trying to remember if she'd seen this language buried in the fine print. She probably had. She'd been so overwhelmed, so desperate to do whatever the judge needed, that she'd likely agreed to anything. Officer Reynolds positioned himself at the front of the courtroom, the German shepherd sitting perfectly still beside him. The dog was immense, probably 90 pounds of muscle and alert intelligence. Its dark eyes scanned the room with the kind of awareness that suggested it understood the gravity of the situation far better than most humans. The dog's chest rose and fell with calm, controlled breathing. It wore an official police harness and tags that glinted under the courtroom lights. "The assessment is straightforward," Officer Reynolds explained in a clipped, professional voice. "The child will be asked to remain in proximity to the animal for approximately 5 minutes. During that time, we'll observe behavioral responses, vocal patterns, ability to maintain composure, and emotional regulation. The animal is fully trained and poses no threat, but many children perceive police dogs as threatening, which creates a controlled, stressful environment." Emma wanted to object, wanted to demand that this stop, that this wasn't fair to Lily. But she knew that objecting would only look bad. It would look like she was trying to protect her daughter from a fair evaluation, like she had something to hide. So she sat there, paralyzed, holding Lily's trembling hand as the 3-year-old stared at the massive dog with wide, fearful eyes. "We'll bring the child forward now," Officer Reynolds said. A court officer approached Emma and Lily, extending his hand gently toward the little girl. Emma looked at her daughter's face and saw pure terror. Lily's lip was trembling. She was shaking. This was exactly the kind of scenario that triggered her anxiety, unfamiliar, overwhelming, frightening. Emma's protective instincts screamed at her to refuse, to shield her child from this trauma. But she couldn't. If she did, it would be used against her in the judgment. She would be labeled as overprotective, as preventing a fair evaluation, as putting her own desires above her child's well-being assessment. "It's okay, baby," Emma whispered, though it was absolutely not okay. "Just walk with the nice officer. The doggy is friendly. I'll be right here watching you." She didn't believe her own words. Her voice shook as she said them. Lily's small hand released Emma's grip reluctantly, and the court officer led the terrified child toward the front of the courtroom. The entire room fell completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming, could hear the distant sound of traffic from the street outside, could hear the soft rustling of fabric as people shifted slightly in their seats. Everyone's attention was laser-focused on the small child in the pink dress and the enormous police dog. Emma held her breath. She didn't even realize she was holding her breath. Her chest felt tight, compressed by fear and helplessness. Beside her, Marcus was absolutely still, his usually expressive face frozen in a mask of professional composure that barely concealed his concern. Lily stood near the dog now, though maintaining the distance Officer Reynolds had specified. The 3-year-old was shaking noticeably, her small frame trembling with the intensity of her fear. Her lip quivered. Emma could see her daughter's chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, the beginning of what might become a full panic attack. The judge leaned forward, watching intently. Patricia Thornton made notes on her legal pad, occasionally glancing up with that confident smile that made Emma want to scream. Daniel sat completely still, his expression unreadable. Officer Reynolds watched Lily with professional attention, making his own observations. The German Shepherd remained sitting, alert but perfectly calm, almost as if it understood what was happening and was determined to remain non-threatening. And then something unexpected happened, something that would shift the entire trajectory of this case, though nobody knew it yet. Lily stopped shaking, not gradually but suddenly. Her body stilled, her rapid breathing slowed. She lifted her eyes from the floor and looked directly at the police dog, studying it with an intensity that mirrored the dog's own scrutiny. For a long moment, neither the child nor the animal moved. It was as if they were seeing each other for the first time, two beings caught in this strange courtroom drama, recognizing something in each other that transcended the legal proceedings, the custody battle, the judgment that was about to be rendered. Emma leaned forward slightly, her anxiety morphing into confusion. What was happening? Why had Lily stopped showing signs of fear? The judge's expression shifted. His stern demeanor relaxed slightly as he noticed the change in Lily's body language. Even Patricia Thornton seemed momentarily thrown off her rhythm, her pen pausing mid-note as she processed what she was witnessing. Nobody in that courtroom knew that they were about to experience something that would change everything. They didn't know that a 3-year-old girl was about to say something that would echo through this courtroom for years to come, that would be discussed in legal circles, that would shift the entire case on its head. They only knew that something unexpected was happening, and in a custody battle where everything had been predictable and controlled, unexpected was the most dangerous thing of all. The moment stretched like taffy, pulling out to impossible lengths. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding a collective breath, suspended in a moment that felt both eternal and instantaneous. Emma's eyes never left her daughter, tracking every minute shift in Lily's small body, every change in her expression, searching for signs of distress that she could use as justification to pull her daughter away from this nightmare. But the distress never came. Instead, something remarkable happened. Lily's shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in tension, began to slowly relax. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, gradually deepened. The trembling that had consumed her small frame seemed to dissipate like morning mist, fading away as if it had never existed at all. Emma blinked, wondering if she was imagining this shift. Was her maternal anxiety playing tricks on her, making her see what she wanted to see rather than what was actually happening? No, the judge had noticed it too. She could see it in the way his posture shifted slightly, the way his stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. Even Patricia Thornton's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment, her pen pausing mid-sentence as she processed the unexpected development. Officer Reynolds remained completely still, his professional expression unchanging, but Emma detected a slight shift in his body language. He was watching Lily now with renewed interest, as if the child had just done something that deviated significantly from his usual observations during these evaluations. Lily tilted her head, a gesture so distinctly her that Emma's heart ached. Her daughter often tilted her head like that when she was trying to understand something, when she was processing information, when she was moving from fear into curiosity. The little girl's dark eyes, still wide but no longer panic-stricken, focused intently on the German shepherd. It was as if she'd suddenly recognized something in the dog, something that transcended the animal's imposing size and official police uniform. The German shepherd, in turn, seemed to return Lily's gaze with equal intensity. The dog's ears perked forward, its dark eyes locking with the child's brown ones. There was an uncanny moment of connection between them, two beings, separated by species and size and circumstance, somehow recognizing something in each other. The dog's tail, which had been still, began to wag, a slow, deliberate movement that suggested not aggression or excitement, but something more measured, more intentional. "Stay where you are, Ms. Martinez," Officer Reynolds said softly, not looking away from Lily. It took Emma a moment to realize he was addressing her daughter, using the formality of her last name in a way that made the small child seem somehow more important, more seen than she'd been just moments before. "Just observe the animal. Let's see what happens naturally." Emma's hands clenched into fists so tight that her fingernails cut into her palms. Let's see what happens naturally. This was an evaluation, a test. They weren't supposed to let things happen naturally. They were supposed to follow protocol, follow the assessment guidelines, determine how Lily responded under controlled stress. The deviation from procedure was deeply unsettling, though Emma wasn't quite sure why. Lily took a small step forward, then another, then another. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the panic or hesitation that Emma had expected. It was as if the little girl had made a decision, a conscious, deliberate choice to move toward the dog rather than away from it. Each step brought her closer to the massive animal, closing the distance that Officer Reynolds had so carefully established. "Stop right there," the bailiff said, moving slightly forward as if preparing to intercept the child. But his voice was uncertain, questioning rather than commanding. Officer Reynolds held up one hand, signaling the bailiff to hold position. "Let her come," he said quietly. "This is interesting." Emma's breath caught. Interesting. In what context was a 3-year-old approaching a police dog without permission or guidance interesting in a positive way? Wasn't the entire point of this evaluation to demonstrate how poorly Lily handled stressful situations? Lily continued walking until she was standing directly in front of the German shepherd. The dog was easily 5 times her size, a massive creature that could have knocked her over with a casual movement of its muscular body. But the dog remained perfectly still, watching the child with an attention that seemed almost respectful. For a long moment, child and dog simply studied each other. Emma found herself holding her breath again. This was the moment where something could go terribly wrong. This was the moment where the dog could react unpredictably, where Lily could panic, where this entire scenario could transform from unusual into traumatic. But instead, something different happened. Lily reached out her tiny hand, her right hand, the one that still bore the small bandage from where she'd scraped it falling off the jungle gym last week, and placed it gently on the dog's head, directly between its alert ears. Her small fingers sank into the dog's thick fur, which was softer than anyone would have expected from looking at the animal's imposing exterior. There was an audible gasp from somewhere in the gallery. Someone whispered something, but Emma couldn't make out the words. Her entire universe had narrowed to include only her daughter and the police dog, only the impossible connection that was forming between them. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. didn't respond with any of the aggressive behaviors that someone untrained might have feared. Instead, the dog's tail continued its slow, deliberate wagging. Its eyes, which had been fixed on Lily's face, softened slightly. The animal appeared to lean into the child's touch, accepting the contact with what looked almost like gratitude. Emma felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand how her anxious, traumatized daughter had transformed into this calm, confident child. But whatever was happening, it was undeniably real, undeniably profound. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes, a gesture that suggested he was processing something that didn't fit into his usual framework for understanding how these evaluations typically proceeded. His stern expression had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Patricia Thornton had stopped writing in her legal pad. Her confident demeanor had cracked visibly. She kept glancing between Lily and Officer Reynolds, as if trying to determine whether this deviation from expected behavior helped or hurt her case. Her expression suggested she wasn't certain. Daniel had lost his casual indifference. He was leaning forward now, his eyes fixed on his daughter, something unreadable crossing his face. It was the first time Emma had seen any genuine emotion from him since the custody battle began. Lily continued to stroke the dog's head and ears, her small hand moving with surprising gentleness. Her lips were moving. Emma could see them forming words, could see her daughter's mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged yet. The little girl was preparing to speak, was gathering the courage to break the profound silence that had settled over the courtroom. Officer Reynolds remained absolutely still, watching with rapt attention. The bailiff had retreated, realizing that the child was in no danger. The court clerk had set down her pen, unable to continue transcribing in the face of this unexpected moment. The entire courtroom was suspended in anticipation. Everyone could feel that something extraordinary was about to happen. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what Lily would say next. And then the 3-year-old girl, the child who was supposed to fall apart under stress, the child who was supposed to demonstrate the emotional fragility that would prove her mother unfit, opened her mouth. The words that emerged would change everything. Silence. Pure, absolute, weighted silence. It was the kind of silence that had texture, that had presence, that seemed to occupy physical space in the courtroom. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the tiny movements your body made just to stay alive. No one dared to interrupt it. No one dared to even shift in their chairs. Lily's small hand continued to rest on the police dog's head, her tiny fingers sinking deeper into the animal's thick fur. Her mouth opened slightly, and Emma could see her daughter gathering her thoughts, accessing words that didn't always come easily to her, especially in moments of stress or strangeness. When Lily finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear, crystal clear. Every word cut through the silence with the precision of a knife cutting through silk. "You're scared too." 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words from a 3-year-old child, and the entire courtroom seemed to shift on its axis. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Around her, she could sense similar reactions from others, sharp intakes of breath, sudden stillness, as if people were trying to process what they'd just heard. The words weren't what anyone had expected. They weren't a cry of fear, or a demand to be taken away, or any of the expected responses from a child undergoing a stress evaluation. They were an observation, a profound, empathetic, completely unexpected observation from a child who was supposed to be emotionally fragile. Officer Reynolds's professional mask cracked visibly. His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned forward, completely focused on what Lily was saying. Judge Whitmore had removed his glasses entirely now, holding them loosely in his hand. His stern expression had transformed into something softer, more vulnerable. His eyes were fixed on the small child with an intensity that suggested he was witnessing something that violated his entire understanding of how the world worked. Patricia Thornton's pen had fallen from her fingers onto her legal pad. She was staring at Lily with an expression that cycled rapidly between confusion, concern, and something that might have been awe. The confidence that had carried her through 18 months of custody battle seemed to be draining from her face, replaced by uncertainty. Emma's own attorney, Marcus Webb, had his hand over his mouth. His tired eyes were wide, and tears had begun to form at the corners. He was seeing something in this moment, something that transcended legal proceedings, that transcended the artificial adversarial process that had consumed the last year and a half of their lives. But Lily wasn't done speaking. She paused, her small hand still resting on the dog's head, her dark eyes fixed on the animal's face. Then she continued, her voice gaining slightly more confidence with each word, as if speaking this truth gave her strength. "Mommy says when you're scared, you gotta be brave, but you can be scared and brave at the same time." The effect was immediate and profound. Someone in the gallery actually sobbed, a short, sharp sound of emotion breaking through professional composure. Emma turned slightly and saw one of the court officers, a tough-looking man who'd probably seen decades of human misery in this courthouse, wiping his eyes. Marcus stood up suddenly, then seemed to realize what he was doing and sat back down. His hand moved from his mouth to his chest, over his heart. Lily's words hung in the air like sacred words, like wisdom that transcended the ordinary, like truth that couldn't be argued against or litigated away. The child was still speaking to the dog, still stroking its head with her small fingers, seemingly unaware of the seismic shift her words had caused in the adults surrounding her. Sometimes grown-ups forget that little people understand big things. Emma felt tears streaming down her face. She wasn't the only one. Across the courtroom, she could see moisture on the cheeks of several spectators, including one attorney from Daniel's legal team who was openly crying. This was beyond strategy now. This had transcended the adversarial process entirely. This was something raw and real and true, something that couldn't be weaponized or strategized around. Lily was still speaking, her voice now steady and clear, as if she'd found some wellspring of wisdom that had been waiting inside her all along, waiting for exactly this moment to emerge. "I'm not scared of you because you're not mean. You're just doing your job like everybody else here." The words landed like a physical blow. Emma could see Judge Whitmore's shoulders shift, could see him putting his glasses back on with trembling fingers. His expression had transformed completely. The stern judicial demeanor had vanished entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, as if he was seeing not just a child, but truth in the form of a child. Patricia Thornton had turned slightly away, one hand pressed against her mouth. Her expression suggested she was struggling with something internal, something that conflicted deeply with the strategy she'd spent months constructing. Daniel had stood up from his seat. Emma didn't think he realized he'd done it. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, on Lily, and his face had gone pale. Something was happening inside him, something visible and real and transformative. His usual mask of indifference had completely shattered. Officer Reynolds had turned away from Lily slightly, his professional composure completely gone. His shoulders were shaking. He was crying. This trained police officer, this professional who dealt with difficult situations regularly, was standing in a courtroom crying because a 3-year-old girl had said something that had cracked open something fundamental in him. Lily removed her hand from the dog's head, stepping back slightly. The words seemed to have exhausted her, or perhaps she simply understood, with the kind of child's wisdom that sometimes seems to transcend age, that she'd said everything that needed to be said. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was heavier, weighted with the impact of truth. It was the silence of a courtroom where everyone had just witnessed something that couldn't be unwitnessed, something that couldn't be argued against or dismissed or strategized around. The German shepherd's tail continued to wag, that slow, deliberate movement that suggested the dog understood, on some level, that it had just been fully seen and fully known by another being. The dog's eyes followed Lily as the little girl walked back toward the court officer who had escorted her to the front of the courtroom. But Lily wasn't walking back to Emma. She was simply walking, moving away from the moment of connection, as if she'd completed some kind of mission and was now ready to move on to whatever came next. Judge Whitmore had put his hand over his eyes. His entire frame was shaking. The bailiff was pretending to look at something official-looking on his desk, but Emma could see the moisture on his weathered face. Marcus reached over and gripped Emma's shoulder. When she looked at him, she saw tears streaming down his face. He didn't speak. There were no words adequate to the moment, but his grip on her shoulder conveyed everything. Something fundamental had just shifted. Something that had seemed impossible had become possible. Something that had seemed lost had been found. Patricia Thornton had gathered her papers with shaking hands. She wasn't organizing them strategically anymore. It looked more like she was simply holding onto something, needing something to focus on besides the magnitude of what had just transpired. Daniel had slowly sat back down in his chair. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the impact of his daughter's words. His expression was unreadable, but it was no longer the cold indifference that had characterized his demeanor throughout the custody battle. The courtroom itself seemed to have transformed. The fluorescent lights that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving just minutes before now seemed almost gentle. The wooden furniture that had felt so cold and rigid now seemed to be embracing the space. Even the air seemed different, charged with something that couldn't be named, that couldn't be reduced to legal terminology or strategic advantage. Judge Whitmore slowly lowered his hand from his eyes. He looked directly at Officer Reynolds, then at Lily, then at Emma. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, barely controlled. "We need to take a recess," he said quietly. "A substantial one, 30 minutes. He stood and left the bench without waiting for acknowledgement, his movement slow, as if he was still processing what had just happened, still integrating the magnitude of what had just transpired. The courtroom erupted into whispers, but they were different whispers. Not the whispers of strategic legal maneuvering, but the whispers of people who had just witnessed something sacred. The courtroom doors had barely closed behind Judge Whitmore before Emma was moving. She pushed back from the table, abandoning all pretense of professional composure, and walked swiftly to where Lily stood with the court officer. The 3-year-old was looking up at the man with confusion, as if trying to understand what had just happened, why everyone had reacted so strangely to her words. When Lily saw her mother, her small face transformed. The stoic composure that had carried her through the evaluation with the police dog dissolved instantly, replaced by the vulnerability of a small child who had just done something enormous and wasn't entirely sure what that something was. Lily's lip trembled, and she reached for Emma with both arms extended. Emma scooped her daughter up, holding her close, feeling the small heartbeat racing against her chest. She didn't care about protocol anymore. She didn't care that they were still in the courtroom, still technically in official proceedings. She simply held her child, pressed her face into Lily's soft curls, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. "You did so good, baby," Emma whispered into her daughter's hair. "You were so brave, so brave." Lily didn't respond, just burrowed deeper into her mother's embrace. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the moment finally catching up with her. Emma could feel the exhaustion settling into her daughter's small body. The emotional labor of what Lily had just accomplished was beginning to manifest in physical weariness. Around them, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer an adversarial space. People were moving slowly, almost reverently. The court clerk was sitting at her desk with her hands folded in front of her, staring at nothing in particular. 2 of the attorneys from the gallery were standing in a corner, speaking in hushed tones that suggested they were discussing something far more significant than routine legal strategy. Officer Reynolds was still standing at the front of the courtroom, his German shepherd sitting calmly beside him. The dog seemed unfazed by the emotional upheaval its presence had catalyzed, but Officer Reynolds himself looked like a man who had experienced something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. He was wiping his eyes methodically, almost mechanically, as if unable to quite believe that he was crying in a public courthouse. Patricia Thornton had left the courtroom entirely, presumably to use the recess to regroup or perhaps to consult with Daniel about a new strategy. Emma couldn't bring herself to care about what her adversary was doing. Right now, all that mattered was holding her daughter, feeling her small heartbeat, acknowledging the magnitude of what had just transpired. Marcus approached Emma slowly, carefully, as if approaching a shrine. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked down at Lily with an expression of wonder and something else, something that looked almost like awe. "That was," he began, then stopped. He shook his head slowly. "I've been practicing family law for 23 years. I've never seen anything like that. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in any courtroom anywhere." Emma could only nod. Words felt inadequate to the moment. How do you describe the experience of witnessing your child break through every barrier, overcome every obstacle, and say something that nobody in the room could argue against? How do you capture the feeling of watching your daughter's words shift the entire landscape of your case, of your life, of everyone's understanding of what matters? "What happens now?" Emma asked quietly. Marcus looked uncertain. "I honestly don't know. That depends on whether the judge is willing to acknowledge what just happened, whether he's willing to let it influence his decision. Technically, Lily's statement isn't admissible evidence. It doesn't conform to any legal standard of proof, but what we all just witnessed," he trailed off, shaking his head. "That changes things. That changes things in ways that the law might not have adequate categories for." Emma held Lily tighter, watching as her daughter's eyes began to drift closed. The little girl had burned through all her emotional reserves, had exhausted herself in the process of being fully authentic and present in a moment that demanded everything she had. Across the courtroom, Daniel sat alone at his table. Patricia Thornton had left, leaving him in isolated contemplation. Emma watched her ex-partner staring at nothing, his hands flat on the table in front of him. His expression was complicated, a mixture of emotions that seemed to be at war with each other. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling in the aftermath of hearing his daughter's words, in witnessing the fundamental truth that Lily had articulated. Emma had seen Daniel cry exactly once during their relationship at his father's funeral. He was not a man who allowed emotion to show. He was controlled, strategic, carefully managed. But now, sitting alone at his table, his composure seemed to be cracking. His jaw was tight, his eyes were unfocused, and his hands were trembling slightly. The bailiff approached Emma and Marcus. "We need to move you to the attorney's conference room," she said quietly. "The judge wants the recess for genuine recess. He doesn't want anyone discussing the case, doesn't want anyone rehearsing testimony or strategy. He's very clear about this." Emma nodded and let Marcus guide her toward the back of the courtroom. As she walked, carrying Lily, she felt the weight of every eye in the room following her. But it was different from before. Before, the looks had felt judgmental, assessing, questioning. Now, the looks felt almost reverent, as if people were witnessing not just a mother and child leaving the courtroom, but something sacred. The conference room was small and quiet, mercifully removed from the intensity of the courtroom proper. Emma gently lowered Lily onto one of the chairs, and her daughter curled onto her side, immediately drifting into the sleep that exhaustion had demanded. Emma sat beside her, keeping one hand on her daughter's small back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. Marcus sat across from them, staring at Lily with an expression that suggested he was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. After several minutes of silence, he spoke quietly. "Do you know what she said? I mean, do you understand the full weight of what she said?" Emma nodded slowly. She saw the dog. She understood that it was scared, just like she's scared. And she understood that brave people are the ones who do their job even when they're afraid. "Exactly," Marcus said. And then she took it one step further. She said that grown-ups forget that children understand big things. "Emma, do you know what that means in the context of this case?" Emma met his eyes, beginning to understand. "It means," Marcus continued, "that Lily understands her entire situation. She understands that there's a custody battle. She understands that everyone here, the judge, the attorneys, you, Daniel, everyone is scared. Everyone is doing their job even though they're afraid. And she's calling everyone to account for pretending that this is just a legal proceeding when it's really something much more fundamental." Emma felt fresh tears beginning to form. She hadn't thought about it in those terms, but Marcus was absolutely right. Lily's words had been a mirror, reflecting back to everyone in that courtroom the fear and anxiety and vulnerability that they were all trying to hide behind legal strategy and professional composure. "What does that mean for the case?" Emma asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. "Honestly, I think it means that Judge Whitmore is going to do something that might not make strategic sense legally, but will make perfect sense humanly. I think he's going to acknowledge what Lily revealed. I think he's going to make a decision based not on the technical evidence presented, but on the fundamental truth that a 3-year-old just expressed in the middle of his courtroom." The 30 minutes of recess ticked slowly by. Emma sat with her hand on Lily's back, watching her daughter sleep, feeling the immense gratitude that her child existed, that she had brought this small person into the world, that Lily had somehow found the courage and wisdom to say exactly what needed to be said. At one point, there was a soft knock on the door. Emma looked up to see Officer Reynolds standing in the doorway, his German shepherd on its leash beside him. "I just wanted to say," Officer Reynolds said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "that in 30 years of law enforcement I've never seen anything like what that little girl did. She wasn't just brave, she was wise. She understood something that most adults spend lifetimes learning." He paused, then added, "I hope the judge figures out how to honor that." Then he was gone, leaving Emma alone with her sleeping daughter and Marcus, all of them suspended in the peculiar silence that follows when the world has shifted on its axis, and everyone is still waiting to see what comes next. The 15-minute warning came through a bailiff, who appeared at the conference room door with a quiet nod. Time had moved strangely during the recess, some moments stretching like taffy, others disappearing entirely. Emma had spent most of it simply sitting with her hand on Lily's back, watching her daughter sleep, processing the magnitude of what had transpired. Now, with the summons to return, Emma gently woke Lily. Her daughter stirred slowly, still drowsy, her small face confused by the sudden return to consciousness. Emma offered her water from a paper cup that Marcus had provided, and Lily drank gratefully, some of the sleep fog beginning to clear from her dark eyes. "We have to go back to the big room now," Emma said softly, preparing her daughter for the return to the intensity of the courtroom. Lily nodded, her small hand gripping Emma's as they prepared to face whatever came next. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Emma felt something shift inside her. Before, she had walked these halls with the desperate hope of someone fighting for survival. Now, something fundamental had changed. She didn't know what the judge would decide, didn't know if the law would allow Lily's words to influence his decision, but something had already been decided at a level deeper than legal precedent or strategic advantage. When they entered the courtroom, the first thing Emma noticed was that everything looked different. Or perhaps nothing looked different, but everything felt different. The courtroom had the same fluorescent lights, the same wooden furniture, the same oppressive architecture that had felt so hostile before. But the atmosphere had transformed completely. Judge Whitmore was already on the bench. Emma noticed immediately that his expression was different. The stern, controlled judicial demeanor was still present, but it had been infused with something else, something softer, more human, more vulnerable. He looked like a man who had spent 30 minutes confronting truths that he hadn't wanted to confront. Patricia Thornton was back at her table, but her confident posture had been replaced by something more tentative. She kept her eyes down, avoiding direct eye contact with Emma or Lily. Her legal pad was in front of her, but there were no fresh notes, no strategic additions. It looked as though she'd spent the recess in contemplation rather than preparation. Daniel sat at his table with his attorney who had arrived during the recess. But Daniel's attention wasn't on his attorney. His eyes were fixed on Lily, watching his daughter with an expression so complicated that Emma couldn't quite read it. There was regret there, she thought, and confusion, and something that might have been recognition, the recognition of a child he hadn't truly seen before. Officer Reynolds and his German shepherd were still present, standing respectfully at the side of the courtroom. The officer's eyes were red, but his expression was calm, witnessing. The dog remained perfectly still, occasionally glancing toward Lily as if maintaining some kind of energetic connection with the child who had seen into its soul. The courtroom filled with people, bailiffs, clerks, people from the gallery who had slipped out during recess but now returned to witness what came next. Word had clearly spread. Something extraordinary had happened in this courtroom, and people wanted to be present for what it meant. Emma settled Lily into the chair beside her. Her daughter was still drowsy from her nap, not fully processing the gravity of returning to this space. Emma kept her hand on Lily's small back, providing the only anchor she could offer. Judge Whitmore looked up from his desk, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. His eyes paused on Lily for a long moment, really looked at her, not as a subject of custody evaluation or legal proceeding, but as a human being, a child, a small person who had just expressed wisdom that had shaken the foundations of this entire adversarial process. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It was quieter than before, more careful, as if he was choosing each word with the awareness that these words would matter. These words would be remembered. "Before we proceed," Judge Whitmore said slowly, "I want to acknowledge what happened in this courtroom approximately 30 minutes ago. I want to be very clear that what occurred was extraordinary." He paused, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes, the same gesture he'd made immediately after Lily's words. This time, it seemed intentional, deliberate, a signal that what he was about to say required him to access a different part of himself. "In my 28 years on the bench," Judge Whitmore continued, "I have conducted countless custody evaluations, heard testimony from psychologists and evaluators and concerned family members. I have tried to make decisions based on the best available evidence, based on legal standards, based on precedent. But today, a 3-year-old child said something that no amount of evidence or testimony or legal precedent could adequately prepare me for." He looked directly at Lily. "That child demonstrated something that we spend our entire legal system trying to quantify and measure: emotional intelligence, empathy, and wisdom. That child looked at an animal that had every reason to frighten her and recognized that it was as scared as she was. That child understood something fundamental about the human condition, that fear and courage are not opposites, but companions." Emma felt tears beginning to stream down her face. Around the courtroom, she could see similar reactions, people moved by the judge's words, by his willingness to acknowledge that something had happened that transcended the normal legal process. Patricia Thornton had her hand over her mouth. Daniel was staring at his daughter with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was undergoing reconstruction. "I'm going to take a different approach to this case than I originally planned," Judge Whitmore said. "Not because that child's statement is legally admissible evidence. It isn't. Not because it technically conforms to any standard of proof or evaluation. It doesn't. But because that child revealed something about truth that matters more than any technical legal framework." He paused, and in that pause, Emma felt the entire trajectory of her life beginning to shift. "That child revealed," Judge Whitmore continued, that what matters in this case is not which parent has the more sophisticated legal strategy, not which parent has the more expensive attorney, not which parent can afford the most comprehensive evaluation. What matters is what kind of parent raises a child who can look fear in the face and recognize the fear in someone else. Emma felt her breath catch. This was it. This was the moment where the judge was going to make the decision that would determine her future, Lily's future, the shape of the rest of their lives. Daniel had stood up from his seat. His attorney was trying to pull him back down, but he seemed oblivious to the gesture. He was staring at his daughter, and his expression suggested that he was finally, truly seeing her for the first time. "I'm going to order a comprehensive reassessment," Judge Whitmore said. "Not another behavioral evaluation, not another standardized test, a reassessment of what both parents need to understand about their child, about themselves, and about what it means to be a parent in a situation as complicated as this one." He looked at Emma, then at Daniel, then back at Lily. "That child," Judge Whitmore said, his voice thick with emotion, "just taught everyone in this courtroom something that most people never learn. She taught us that the law can't measure what matters. That courage isn't the absence of fear. That wisdom can come from the mouth of a 3-year-old. And that sometimes the most important truths can't be contained by legal strategy or adversarial process." The courtroom was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing something sacred, something that would mark a before and after in all of their lives. Patricia Thornton had put her pen down. She wasn't taking notes anymore. She was simply sitting, hands folded, looking smaller and more human than she had during the entire custody battle. Officer Reynolds had a hand on his dog's head, and both of them were watching the judge with quiet reverence. Emma reached over and pulled Lily closer to her. Her daughter leaned into her mother's embrace, still not fully understanding the magnitude of what she had accomplished, still simply being herself, honest, compassionate, and wise beyond her years. The moment had arrived, the moment where everything changed. Not in the judge's formal ruling, not in the legal details that would follow, but in this single moment of acknowledgement, of recognition, of one man in a position of power willing to admit that a child's truth had shown him something his years of legal experience had failed to reveal. Everything that came next would be different. The judge took several minutes before continuing. He sat back in his chair, his eyes closed, as if gathering strength for what he was about to say. The courtroom waited in that profound silence, the kind that Emma had come to recognize as sacred, the silence of a space where important things were happening. When Judge Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice was steady but carried the weight of genuine conviction. "I'm going to outline the custody arrangement I'm establishing, effective immediately," he began. "But before I do, I want to explain the reasoning behind it, because this reasoning is more important than the legal precedent or procedure that normally governs these decisions." He looked directly at Lily, who was now watching the judge with the curious attention that children sometimes give to adults who are paying genuine attention to them. "That child," Judge Whitmore said, "demonstrated today that she has been taught values of empathy, courage, and emotional honesty. These are the values that matter, not whether her mother works full-time or part-time, not whether her father earns a higher income, not which parent can provide more material comfort. What matters is which parent or parents can teach her to understand fear, to recognize it in others, and to act with compassion anyway." Emma felt her hand trembling. She gripped Lily's shoulder more firmly, trying to ground herself in the present moment. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am establishing a custody arrangement that reflects what this child has revealed about what truly matters. Primary physical custody will remain with the mother, Emma Martinez. This reflects the bond that has clearly been established and the emotional foundation that has allowed this child to develop such remarkable emotional intelligence." Emma's eyes filled with tears, primary custody. She would have Lily most of the time. She wouldn't lose her daughter. However, the judge said, and the word hung in the air with significant weight, this is conditional on specific requirements that I believe will benefit both parents and, most importantly, this child. Judge Whitmore pulled out a document that his clerk handed to him. He adjusted his glasses and began reading with careful attention to each word. First, both parents will participate in mandatory parenting classes, specifically designed around teaching emotional intelligence and helping children develop healthy relationships with fear and courage. These classes will be taken together, as co-parents, regardless of the personal challenges that presents. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing this requirement. Emma could see him processing, his expression suggesting that this was not the outcome he had anticipated. Second, the judge continued, both parents will participate in individual therapy with a licensed family therapist. The focus of this therapy will be on understanding their own fear responses, their own emotional triggers, and how those responses have affected their parenting. Patricia Thornton was making notes now, but her expression suggested she was documenting a decision that couldn't be appealed, that was based on judicial discretion rather than legal argument. Third, Judge Whitmore said, there will be a comprehensive reassessment conducted by Dr. Margaret Chen, a child psychologist specializing in emotional intelligence and family dynamics. This assessment will be focused not on evaluating which parent is better, but on understanding how both parents can optimize their relationships with this child while honoring her demonstrated emotional needs. The judge paused, looking over his glasses at both parents. The father, Daniel Chen, will have scheduled visitation every other weekend, beginning Saturday at 9 a.m. and concluding Sunday at 5 p.m. Additionally, he will have 2 weeknight dinners per week with his daughter. These visitations are contingent on his completion of the parenting classes and his participation in individual therapy. Emma realized she was holding her breath. This wasn't the worst-case scenario she'd feared. Daniel would still have meaningful time with Lily, but the primary stability would remain with Emma. Furthermore, the judge said, and his voice took on a new intensity, during these visitations, Mr. Chen is expected to model the emotional honesty and vulnerability that his daughter demonstrated in this courtroom. She is not to be used as a pawn in any ongoing disputes. She is to be treated as a human being with her own emotional needs and her own capacity for understanding far deeper than her age might suggest. Judge Whitmore's gaze fixed on Daniel with unmistakable intensity. That child looked at a police dog and recognized its fear. She understood that the dog was doing its job despite being afraid. I expect her father to demonstrate that same level of emotional maturity. I expect him to understand that being a good parent sometimes means acknowledging vulnerability, acknowledging fear, and moving forward anyway. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't object. Something in the judge's words seemed to have penetrated his defenses in a way that legal argument never could. Now, the judge said, turning his attention to Emma, for the mother, your custody arrangement comes with equally important requirements. You are to seek individual therapy to address the stress and anxiety that has been consuming you during this custody battle. Part of being a good parent is taking care of your own emotional well-being so that you have the psychological resources to care for your child. Emma nodded. She had been so focused on fighting, on surviving, on keeping her daughter safe, that she hadn't acknowledged how depleted she'd become. I also want to note, Judge Whitmore said, that you will not be required to maintain the excessively demanding work schedule that has caused stress in your household. While I'm not mandating specific changes, I'm nodding for the record that this court recognizes that quality time with one's child is more valuable than financial accumulation. Both parents need to strike a more sustainable balance. He looked at the courtroom clerk. I'm also ordering that both parents receive copies of research on emotional intelligence in children, on how parental stress affects child development, and on healthy family dynamics. Reading and understanding this material will be required for both parents. Patricia Thornton had stopped writing. She was simply sitting, listening, processing a decision that had shifted from adversarial to restorative. This arrangement will be reviewed in 6 months, the judge continued. At that time, Dr. Chen will present her findings, and we will reconvene to assess progress. If both parents have engaged fully in therapy and parenting classes, if they've demonstrated genuine effort to understand what their daughter revealed, then we'll discuss whether any modifications are necessary. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and looked directly at both parents. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority infused with human compassion. "This case has been about what's best for Lily Martinez. But today, Lily Martinez taught us all what that actually means. It doesn't mean choosing one parent over another. It means both parents understanding that they are partners in raising a child who has already demonstrated wisdom that many adults never achieve." He looked at Lily. "You showed us that fear and courage are not opposites. You showed us that you can be frightened and still be brave. You showed us that everyone is scared sometimes, and that doesn't make them bad or unworthy. You showed us that a person can do their job, fulfill their responsibilities, even when they're afraid." The judge's voice had become thick with emotion. "And you did it without anger, without blame, without judgment. You did it with pure compassion. That's what I want both your parents to understand. That's what I want everyone in this courtroom to understand." He put his glasses back on and returned to his formal judicial voice, but the emotion remained present beneath it. "The custody order will be filed immediately. Court-appointed advocate Patricia Morrison will be assigned to monitor implementation and to check in with the family quarterly. Any violations of this order, using the child as a messenger between parents, attempting to alienate the child from the other parent, failing to maintain the required therapy or parenting classes, will result in immediate modification of the custody arrangement." Patricia Thornton was now looking at the judge with an expression that suggested she was seeing him differently, not as a judge rendering decisions, but as a person making a statement about what matters. "This court is in recess," Judge Whitmore said, his gavel descending with finality that felt different from before. It felt not like an ending but like a beginning. Emma immediately pulled Lily into her arms. Around the courtroom, people were beginning to move to process what had just happened, but the energy had shifted fundamentally. This wasn't a victory for one side or a defeat for another. This was something different. This was acknowledgement. This was healing. This was a judge using his power not to declare a winner but to say, "Here is what wisdom looks like. Here is what matters. Here is how we move forward." Officer Reynolds gave a small nod of approval. Even Patricia Thornton, defeated strategically but transformed somehow, offered a slight acknowledgement of the justice that had been served, not the justice of courts, but the justice of human recognition and transformation. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary moment in the courtroom. Emma sat on the back porch of her small house, watching Lily play in the yard with the kind of uninhibited joy that had been absent for so long. Her daughter was building something with blocks, a tower, or perhaps a house, or perhaps just a creation that existed only in Lily's imaginative mind. Whatever it was being constructed with confidence and lightness, without the anxiety that had characterized her play for the previous year and a half. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Week by week, Lily's selective mutism had receded. She was speaking more, laughing more, engaging more fully with the world around her. The panic attacks had diminished from weekly to monthly to occasional. The watchful tension that had lived in her small body had slowly dissolved, replaced by the natural ease of a child who felt safe. But the transformation wasn't just in Lily. Emma had changed too. She'd reduced her work hours to 30 per week, a decision that had initially terrified her because it meant accepting financial insecurity. But something surprising had happened when she'd stepped back from the constant rush. She discovered that she had more energy for her daughter, more patience, more capacity for the kind of presence that Lily needed. She'd started taking the parenting classes that the judge had mandated, and what she'd expected to be a burden had instead become revelatory. She was learning to identify her own fear responses, to understand how her anxiety about losing Lily had translated into controlling behavior, to develop a different relationship with vulnerability. The therapy had been harder. Dr. Sarah Williams, her assigned therapist, had gently but persistently asked Emma questions about her own childhood, her own parents, the messages she'd received about what it meant to be strong and independent. Emma had discovered, to her surprise, that much of her driving anxiety came from a deep, unexamined belief that she had to do everything perfectly to be worthy of love. The realization had been painful, but it had also been liberating. Daniel's transformation had been more dramatic. The parenting classes had initially seemed like punishment to him, something imposed by a judge who didn't understand his perspective. But something had shifted in him during that first class. The instructor had shown a video of children discussing fear, young kids talking about being scared of the dark, scared of failing at school, scared of disappointing their parents. And Daniel had watched that video and thought about Lily, about how she'd looked at a police dog and recognized fear without judgment. He'd approached Emma after the second parenting class, something he'd never done during the entire custody battle. There had been no legal strategy, no attempt to gain advantage. He'd simply said, "I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you were trying to teach her." The apology had shocked Emma. She'd expected him to remain defensive, to insist that he'd been right all along. But something in the courtroom, something in his daughter's words, had cracked open his defenses in a way that no legal argument ever could. Daniel had thrown himself into therapy with surprising dedication. His therapist had helped him understand that his need for control and perfection stemmed from his own childhood experiences. A father who'd been emotionally cold, who'd valued achievement above all else, who'd made Daniel feel that love was conditional on success. Daniel had perpetuated that pattern with his daughter, unconsciously trying to shape her into someone who would make him feel worthy. But Lily's words in the courtroom had revealed something to him. A child could be wise and fearful simultaneously. A child could be brave without being invulnerable. A child didn't have to earn love by performing perfectly. The visitations had transformed as a result. When Daniel picked up Lily for their weeknight dinners, he no longer came with an agenda to demonstrate his superiority as a parent. Instead, he came to listen, to be present, to let his daughter simply be herself. He'd started taking her to parks instead of upscale restaurants. He'd started asking her about her feelings instead of just about her accomplishments. He'd started being honest about his own struggles, his own fears, modeling the emotional vulnerability that Lily had demonstrated for him in that courtroom. Emma watched Lily's tower begin to topple. Her daughter paused for a moment, watching her creation fall, then simply smiled and began building something else. There was no frustration, no panic, just acceptance and the willingness to try again. This was what the judge had recognized, Emma thought. This was what Lily had revealed, that wisdom wasn't about avoiding failure or fear. It was about moving through them with grace and compassion. The comprehensive reassessment had been completed by Dr. Margaret Chen 2 months ago. Her report had been remarkable. Instead of ranking one parent as better, Dr. Chen had documented how both parents had made significant changes and how those changes had directly benefited Lily. She'd noted Lily's increased emotional expressiveness, her decreased anxiety, her improved sleep patterns, her ability to discuss feelings without becoming overwhelmed. Most importantly, Dr. Chen had written, "This child has demonstrated wisdom far beyond her years. The adults in her life are now modeling the lessons she taught them. The result is a family system that is moving toward genuine health and integration rather than adversarial division." The judge had read Dr. Chen's report during the 6-month review, and had modified the custody arrangement only slightly, extending Daniel's visitation to include one weekday afternoon, in recognition of the genuine progress he'd made. But more significantly, Judge Whitmore had used the occasion to formally commend both parents for their willingness to change, their willingness to prioritize their daughter's well-being over their own need to win. Emma had received a letter last month from the State Bar Association. They were using her case, with identifying details changed, but with the essential narrative preserved, as a teaching case in family law training programs. Judge Whitmore had written a legal article about the case, titled "When Children Teach Courts: Wisdom Beyond Legal Strategy." The article had been published in a prestigious law review and had generated significant discussion among legal professionals about how courts could better honor emotional truth alongside legal precedent. Officer Reynolds had made an unexpected appearance at Emma's house about 4 months after the courtroom hearing. He'd brought his German Shepherd, and he'd asked if Lily would like to visit the police station sometime and learn more about the dog. That visit had happened last month, and Lily had been fascinated, not frightened, but genuinely interested in understanding the animal that had sparked such transformation. The officer had told Emma something that had stayed with her. "Your daughter didn't just teach us about courage and fear that day. She taught us that animals can sense wisdom in people. That dog knew somehow that this child saw it, truly saw it. That kind of recognition is rare. Don't let her lose that gift." Emma had no intention of letting Lily lose it. If anything, she was working to nurture it, to teach her daughter that the capacity to recognize fear in others, to acknowledge vulnerability without judgment, to move forward despite being afraid. These were superpowers in a world that often demanded people pretend to be invulnerable. Gloria, Emma's mother, had become the family's quiet anchor through all of this. She'd watched her granddaughter transform and her daughter begin to heal, and she'd continued to be present to listen, to affirm that everyone was doing their best. 6 months ago, Emma had walked into a courtroom terrified of losing her daughter. She'd believed that this custody battle would define the rest of her life, that the outcome would determine her worth as a mother. Now, she understood something different. The outcome hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about transformation. A transformation that had started with a 3-year-old child looking at a police dog and saying the simplest, most profound truth: "You're scared too." Lily looked up from her tower and caught Emma's eye. She waved, a small gesture of connection, and Emma waved back. Her daughter's face was open, peaceful, free of the tension that had dominated her early childhood. The story of what happened in that courtroom had quietly begun to circulate. Legal professionals shared it as an example of restorative justice. Parents mentioned it when discussing custody arrangements. Children's psychologists referenced it when talking about emotional intelligence. But for Emma and Daniel and Lily, it wasn't a story. It was a lived experience, a transformation that had become woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Emma often reflected on Judge Whitmore's final words before dismissing the court. "Here is what wisdom looks like. Here is what matters. Here is how we move forward." She'd come to understand that this wasn't just instruction for her family. It was instruction for everyone. It was the recognition that the smallest among us sometimes see the most clearly. That a child's honesty could teach adults about courage. That the most important truths transcend legal frameworks, transcend strategy, transcend everything except the simple human recognition of what actually matters. Lily's tower had grown again, taller this time, more complex. Emma watched her daughter build with confident hands, and she felt a deep gratitude for this child who had somehow found the words to say what needed to be said, who had cracked open a courtroom full of people and let something true pour through. Everything that came after that moment, the healing, the growth, the transformation, had flowed from that single moment of a child's authentic wisdom. And that, Emma thought, was the real victory. Not the custody arrangement, not the legal victory, but the simple fact that her daughter had been seen, truly seen for who she was, that her daughter's wisdom had been honored, that her daughter had taught everyone around her what it meant to be brave and scared at the same time. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the yard, Emma called out to Lily. Her daughter came running, her tower forgotten, ready for whatever came next. And Emma opened her arms to receive her child, grateful for the journey that had brought them here to this moment of peace.